25 years ago, the God helmet captivated America. The God helmet was an experimental device invented by professors Stanley Coren and Michael Persinger that was designed to induce religious experiences. It was a humble ski helmet wired with electromagnets that could be aimed at specific parts of the brain. Dr. Persinger, a neuroscientist, hypothesized that by aiming at the temporal lobes, he could use transcranial magnetic stimulation to disrupt the communication between the hemispheres of the brain and induce the feeling of a non-physical presence, a synthetic ghost. His research subjects wore the helmet for 35 minutes in a sensory deprivation room, while Persinger sent different electromagnetic patterns through the brain. He claimed to have discovered that one pattern, which he called Burst X, triggered a feeling of presence. In fact, many of Persinger's subjects reported mystical experiences and altered states while wearing the helmet, and he claimed that at least 80% of his subjects have felt a sense of presence, of someone else in the room with them. He speculated that he had discovered a method for triggering religious experiences, and that he'd even discovered the origin of religion in the brain. In 1999, Wired magazine published a full-length story about Persinger's helmet, in which the article's writer, the popular author Jack Hitt, tried the helmet for himself. Hitt was skeptical, and he avoided admitting he'd experienced the presence of God like others had, but he did confess that something took place, even if that something was just a fairly convincing out-of-body experience. Turns out, though, that physically, the God helmet wasn't doing anything. The magnets were not powerful enough to have influenced people's brains, just the surface of their skin, equivalent to the magnetic field of a phone or a hairdryer. Subsequent studies have tried to confirm the efficacy of the God helmet in producing religious experiences, but have come to dubious conclusions. While a 2014 Brazilian study claims to have replicated his results, other scientists have criticized it for being poorly designed with a low sample size, and the participants being tested under different experimental conditions. Earlier studies in 2005, 2009, and 2012 could not replicate Persinger's findings. The 2005 study concluded that the helmet was ineffective and that Persinger had achieved his results not through electromagnetism, but through the power of suggestion. Persinger's test subjects wore the God helmet in a particularly weird setting, sensory deprivation, sitting there for over 30 minutes wearing opaque goggles within an acoustic chamber lit by a dim red light. This likely primed them towards certain experiences. In fact, since the 2005 study, the scientific community has tended to see Persinger's experiment as an example of the placebo effect. A placebo is a medical treatment that seems real but is not. A placebo is used during drug trials, like a pill lacking the active ingredient of the drug being tested. The control group takes the placebo while the experimental group takes the active ingredient. Medical professionals use the term placebo effect to refer to the phenomenon of patients' symptoms improving under a placebo. What's interesting is that while the placebo might be fake, the placebo effect is very, very real. The placebo effect is a relatively common phenomenon that's being studied more and more in an effort to understand why and how it happens. Researchers have especially considered the psychological mechanisms behind the placebo effect, including a patient's expectations, conditioning, learning, motivation, bodily focus, reward, and reduction of anxiety. So to say that Persinger's subjects experienced the placebo effect is to say that the God helmet was itself a placebo, working not through physical stimulation of the brain, but through the power of suggestion. It's also to say that Persinger's subjects felt God or a presence precisely because they were psychologically conditioned to expect as much. Conditioning involving things like heightening their expectation with science-y-looking gadgetry and placing them in suggestive, anxiety-reducing environments. Rather than discovering a new way to trigger mystical experiences, Persinger's experiment has instead inspired a whole generation of scientists of religion to take notice of the placebo effect and use the God helmet to study it. In 2017, a team of researchers used the God helmet to study the placebo effect when it comes to inducing religious experiences. What they were most interested in was studying the influence of alcohol on what they called expectancy-driven mystical experiences. Could being drunk make you more likely to fall for God helmet suggestion? So where do you go to get a large group of people drinking alcohol and willing to put on a God helmet that they think will alter their brains? The answer, a Dutch music festival. The scientists experimented on a bunch of people at a Dutch music festival called Lowlands. Lowlands is kind of like a Dutch Burning Man, where 65,000 people come together and create a city out of nowhere, and spend 3 days partying, listening to music, and creating art. The researchers chose to conduct their study at a festival for several reasons. There would be a lot of people intoxicated, and festival goers would be the more adventurous, experimental type. I mean, after all, the current website for the Lowlands Festival describes it as being a true backpacker's Garden of Eden and Holland's most adventurous cultural outdoor event. The perfect place for scientific inquiry into placebo-induced mysticism. The results of their study emphasized just how much people's preconceived notions about religion and spirituality can make them more open to the power of suggestion. To attract volunteers, the researchers advertised it before the festival, and they try to make it sound as tempting as possible. The study was pitched to concertgoers as tripping with the God helmet. Researchers at the University of Amsterdam will electromagnetically stimulate your brain to elicit spiritual experiences. Now, if you're picturing the research being conducted in a mystical, new agey looking atmosphere, think again. The experiment site was purposely designed to reflect the rigor of scientific research. The idea being that if it looked sciencey, this would boost the God helmet's placebo effect by making it seem more credible. To conduct the study, the researchers pre-selected 199 festival goers and measured their alcoholic intake right before they participated. The team hypothesized that the higher a participant's blood alcohol level, the more their executive functioning would be impaired, making them more susceptible to the placebo effect of the God helmet. After having their blood alcohol measured, the test subjects filled out survey questions about their religiosity and spirituality. Then the subjects were blindfolded, hooked up to electronic measuring devices, given earphones that played white noise, and provided with a response key to press when they had an extraordinary experience. At the end of the experiment, they filled out questions about their experiences. So what happened? Well, some of the festival goers said they had extraordinary mystical experiences. One said, "It felt as if I was floating, as if I no longer was on the chair." Another said, "I had the feeling that the helmet was taking control over me. My head started turning around, and my eyes were spinning." Yet another should get a poetry award. "I felt as if I was floating, like being slowly lifted. My heart slowed down and my breathing sometimes stopped, because of the floating feeling similar to an MDMA experience. I felt stable, and after a while it seemed like an external influence was affecting me." But as it turns out, it was all fake. Purely 100% placebo. None of the equipment, neither the God helmet nor the fancy electronic measuring devices were turned on. The subjects had been duped. Their expectations had been carefully manipulated with props that suggested scientific rigor. But of course, for the researchers, this was the point. Their study was based on the idea that the God helmet was a placebo, something that could potentially trigger a religious experience purely through the power of suggestion. Remember, the researchers wanted to find out if there was a link between intoxication and susceptibility to the placebo effect. It turns out that there wasn't, as in participants with higher measures of intoxication were not more likely to claim a mystical experience while wearing the God helmet. The researchers did, however, find an interesting correlation between the placebo effect and religious experience. They found that people who already identified as spiritual before the experiment were more likely to experience something extraordinary. As the study concluded, extraordinary experiences are most likely to occur in participants who have a spiritual worldview that matches the expectations provided by the manipulation. In other words, the people who self-identified as spiritual and who went in believing that the God helmet could do something and could induce spiritual experiences were most likely to have an extraordinary experience while wearing it. While this might sound like common sense, the Lowlands experiment sheds light on how the placebo effect might factor into religious experience in general. The researchers were not asking, as Persinger did, how science can be used to induce religious experiences. Instead, they asked how science could be used to elicit them. The difference between induce and elicit is the difference between real medicine and the placebo. The former implies actively causing a response, while the latter suggests drawing out a response already present. Persinger believed that religious experiences could be electrically stimulated in the brain, essentially thinking he was working with the active ingredients of a drug, so to speak, insofar as he believed he was influencing the actual electrical functioning of the brain. But what he really had was a powerful placebo that could draw out experiences from people who wanted to have those experiences in the first place. The Lowlands researchers confirmed this. Using his helmet as a placebo, they found hard evidence that it might be easiest to elicit religious experiences from people who are already looking for them. Some people thought the God helmet worked simply because they wanted it to work, because they believed in modern science, but also because they saw themselves as spiritual and therefore open to religious experiences. Religious experience has always fascinated scholars of religion. One of the earliest and most influential thinkers in this field was William James. He was a psychologist and philosopher who argued that if you want to understand religion, you need to pay close analytical attention to the kinds of experiences that people report. Things like visions, sudden conversions, and overwhelming feelings of presence, like what we saw with the God helmet. Religious studies is all about analyzing seemingly straightforward ideas, like belief, experience, and sacred, and showing how these ideas are actually really messy and contested once you start pulling them apart. If you want to start analyzing these concepts yourself, I really recommend the book Religion in 50 Words. Let's see if I can find it here just by looking at the viewfinder. It's on my shelf. Yep, here it is. Religion in 50 Words. It's basically a glossary of 50 really tricky terms in religious studies, like belief, experience. There's an entire chapter on experience, the sacred, ritual, you name it. Ideas that you take for granted, but actually are really complicated once you start studying them. I've actually been leading a group through this book over at the Religion Department, our new online learning platform where scholars of religion teach live classes, seminars, and guided reading groups. So in my guided reading group, every other week, I unpack another chapter in Religion in 50 Words, and I talk through questions with everyone who's watching live. The way I see it, it's basically a chill live book club meets academic seminar hybrid. It's very nerdy and it's a lot of fun. Our guided reading groups are open only to members of the Religion Department. Members can join any guest lecture live, and you also get instant access to our full library of past lectures going back to 2023. We've hosted scholars of Buddhism talking about hungry ghosts, a scholar of New Age spirituality talking about quantum mysticism, you name it, we have a really big course catalog. Members also get 50% off our multi-week seminars, which are deeper, more interactive courses taught by amazing scholars of religion, like our ongoing Intro to Coptic class where you can learn the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. So to join, go to religiondepartment.com/membership. You'll get a full year of live events, access to the whole library of lectures, and exclusive access to our bi-weekly reading group. Again, that's religiondepartment.com/membership, and I hope to see you at our next session.